So, Marvel has created Red Wolf in 1970, but the version that you're reading is very different from the version that got its own series in 1972. So, why is that? Well, one reason that we can argue is that Stan Lee thought it wasn't that character wasn't Indian enough. Originally created by Roy Thomas, the version of Red Wolf that appeared in Avengers is a character that is advocating for cooperation between Native Americans and white people, but it's actually on a mission of revenge because his family's been killed. He's a Vietnam veteran, very much rooted in a contemporary moment. But in the 1970s, especially in the early 1970s, as Marvel is sort of battling it out with DC, Marvel editor Stan Lee sought to broaden the character lineup in the hopes of trying to grow the audience. At the same time, of course, as we well know, he's also broadening the sort of like racial and gender dynamics in terms of the comics that are being produced. So if you think about the early 70s, Marvel is really sort of pushing itself to put out multiple titles. In the early 70s, Marvel puts out more than 100 different titles, many of which don't last very long, more than 2 years. But they're doing so with this idea of they're in competition with DC Comics, but they're also trying to grow their audience. They're also mining the popular culture, right? So on the one hand, yes, they're providing characters that are coming from a different racial background, providing more women characters, but they're also doing things like tapping into the kung fu craze or tapping into the weakening of the comics code to start provide comics like The Tomb of Dracula, where they introduce a character called Blade, who's like the black vampire hunter that a lot of people know. So when you look at these comics I have at the bottom, characters like Luke Cage, the Black Panther gets his first solo series in this period when he takes over Jungle Action. But a character like Master of Kung Fu very much is tapping into that import craze that is growing from martial arts films in places like New York and Los Angeles. And then there are lesser known characters you probably never heard of that are female characters like Night Nurse or Shanna the She-Devil, or characters you probably might have heard of like Miss Marvel, which comes a little bit later than this, but is also a character where Marvel is trying to sort of like embrace greater diversity and take into account the women's rights movement. So in the context of like trying to create a character that's more authentic than the first Red Wolf, that's the version that you're reading, right? The Massive Avenger of the Western Plains. This Red Wolf and is firmly set in the Old West and is following a mission of trying to be a force of reconciliation between Native Americans and whites, and in the context that many of the reading audience of the 1970s would recognize. And it's interesting because Marvel also puts out some problematic Western characters that reimagine the post Civil War experience by pairing a black character that grew up on a plantation with his white quote unquote brother. That's the Gunhawks, Kid Cassidy, and Reno Williams, and those characters and this character at some level basically imagine a kind of context around a West that, like much of the sort of racial progressivism of the 1970s, is aiming to try to get past some of the structural problems, get past the sort of like the blatant discrimination associated with how Native Americans are being treated. And you see this in the story that is being read here, right? Like, read it as a commentary on, yes, white people, some white people in the past were very bad, but it can be overcome. And this kind of racial progressivism was quite common in comics at this time, and we should think about this as well as some of the other characters that come out in the 1970s who were black, who are more conservative in their outlook. I'm thinking here of a character called Black Goliath, who had a very sort of bootstrapped and rig yourself up kind of narrative attached to him, are very different than the characters that were a little bit more direct in their confrontation with the system. You can read Luke Cage that way, and his very complicated background as being a prisoner who was experimented on, and so on and so forth. So at some level, Red Wolf makes perfect sense as a character at a moment that's trying to represent a kind of evolution of Native American concerns in light of a public activism by that group, right? If you think about the civil rights movement leading to a bunch of black characters, you can think about the American Indian movement leading to a kind of character like Red Wolf. And so we should contrast this character with the stories that you're seeing in Moonshot, the indigenous comics collection. This is volume 3 that you're reading from. There's 2 other volumes, again, in the collection that you can't get to. And when you think about these stories, you should sort of separate how this vision of a quote-unquote Native American story world radically differs from what's being offered by the Marvel character. Historic and important, but what we can see, of course, in the through line here is a massive evolution, especially with the recognition, as you can see, that Native American artists and writers are creating these stories. And as such, they delve much more deeply into like a kind of nuance and depth and width when it comes to like the different views on indigenous thought, indigenous culture, and indigenous concerns that can be depicted in comics. And of course, this is an independent comic in the sense that it was funded through a Kickstarter, but you can see very differently when you start thinking about the stories that you're gonna experience here, that their familiarity with the comic form, but the themes, the story worlds, the depictions, the art, they say something very different. And so this sort of marks a kind of evolution, right? When we think about these early stories represented by Red Wolf and these early immediate depictions of Native Americans, when you look at Moonshot, you're seeing the scope of the journey being when it comes to Native American depictions in comics.